The final speaker on our program this morning is His Excellency David Comissiong, Ambassador of Barbados to CARICOM. Ambassador Comissiong.
Protocol having been so well established, permit me simply to say, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades, good morning. Every year, we gather at this monument in remembrance of the 73 passengers and crew who perished in that Cubana flight just off this west coast of Barbados back in 1976. And each year we come to this ceremony with feelings and emotions of sadness, solemnity, and anger. Anger at the tragic and senseless loss of life, but also anger at the fact that the two masterminds of the bombing of the Cubana aircraft, Luis Posada Corrales and Orlando Bosch, went to their graves without ever having been held accountable and punished for the horrendous and mind-numbing pain and injury that they inflicted on so many Cuban and Guyanese and North Korean families, and on the nations and people of Cuba, Guyana, North Korea, and indeed Barbados. But this year we come with yet another emotion added into that complex of sadness, solemnity, and anger. We come with feelings of pride. Pride that on the 6th of December 2022, the heads of government of our Caribbean community and Cuba exhibited an exemplary sense of responsibility and further dignified the 6th of October by designating it CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism. When Barbados piloted the resolution at the 8th CARICOM Cuba Summit in December of last year to designate CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism, we did so with the understanding that the Cubana terrorist tragedy of 1976 was the first act of terrorism of such a magnitude involving a civilian airliner, and that it took place a full 25 years before the infamous 9/11 event, and is, in a very real sense, the poster child event of international terrorism. A CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism is therefore a day on which the Republic of Cuba, all 15 full CARICOM member states, and all 5 associate CARICOM member states are expected to engage in activities to highlight the evils of terrorism, to evince our collective resolve to condemn and combat all forms of terrorism, and to demonstrate our determination to preserve our Caribbean as a zone of peace. Indeed, if there is one group of people on the face of this earth who should know something about terrorism and be qualified to speak to the world about terrorism, it is the Caribbean people. And I say so because virtually our entire history in the Caribbean has been all about having terrorism inflicted upon us by powerful, marauding European nations and entities, and having to resist and transcend such terrorism. Our Caribbean region was founded in the most extreme forms of violence, warfare, genocide, criminality, and terrorism. From Christopher Columbus in 1492 and the whole process of the extermination, the genocide of the indigenous people that he put in motion, to the centuries of enslavement of our African ancestors. It was terrorism. And I always remind people that the concept of the concentration camp wasn't born in 1930s Nazi Germany. In fact, if you want to find the very first concentration camps, you have to look to 17th and 18th century Barbados and Jamaica and Antigua, Guyana, Cuba, Haiti. Those were the first concentration camps. So let us be clear. This issue of terrorism is an issue that we Caribbean people know only too well. And if our history is properly interpreted, it is clear that it has been a history of resisting, overcoming, and transcending terrorism. But of course, if there is one Caribbean nation that has been the foremost target of terrorism, inclusive of state-sponsored terrorism, both in the distant past and in the here and now, it is the Republic of Cuba. Ever since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution on the 1st of January 1959, the nation and people of Cuba have been victims of the most horrendous acts of terrorism. A short list of some of the most notorious examples of terrorism inflicted on the Cuban people would be as follows, and I just give a few. The blowing up of the La Cubre boat in Havana Harbor in 1960, killing 70 people. The fomenting of internal subversion within Cuba. The organizing and training of mercenaries to attack Cuba, culminating in the Bay of Pigs invasion of 17th April 1961, causing the deaths of 157 Cubans and wounding hundreds. The deliberate introduction into Cuba in 1981 of an epidemic of hemorrhagic dengue fever. The arson at the Levantam Daycare Center in Havana in 1980 with 570 children inside. The blowing up of hotels in Cuba in 1998 in a campaign orchestrated by the said Luis Posada Corriles, who masterminded the bombing of the Cubana aircraft. And I can go on and on with examples of this continuous assault on the people and nation of Cuba. Now, the list of terrorist acts that I've just outlined is a list of acts of physical destruction, blowing up planes, blowing up hotels. But there's another type of imposition on the nation and people of Cuba that in light of the tremendous damage and injury that it has done to Cuban lives could be considered to be an act of terrorism. Of course, I refer to the imposition since 1962 by the government of the United States of America of a devastating economic, trade, and financial blockade on Cuba, an illegal blockade that has existed for some 63 years now. And to add insult to injury, on the 11th of January of 2021, in the last and dying days of the Trump presidency, Trump and his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, cynically, perversely, and vindictively placed Cuba on the U.S. State Department's unilateral list of countries that sponsor terrorism. Now, as we all know, far from being a perpetrator or sponsor of terrorism, Cuba has, in fact, been the victim of no less than 713 acts of terrorism, the vast majority of which have been organized, financed, and executed by persons or organizations based in the territory of the United States of America. The Cuban government has calculated that the acts of terrorism against Cuba have killed some 3,478 persons and have maimed 2,099 Cuban citizens. In addition, damages to life and property have been calculated to reach the total of 181 billion US dollars. That is the country that they put on a list of state sponsors of terrorism. As part of its constitution, Cuba has ratified its condemnation and rejection of terrorism in all its forms. And indeed, Cuba has maintained a manifestly clear and transparent position in the fight against terrorism. But as Mr. Trump and Mr. Pompeo were only too well aware, the negative consequences derived from inclusion in this State Department list are numerous, including restrictions to Cuba's exports, diminished commercial benefits, obstacles to obtaining credit from international financial institutions, and the list goes on and on. Furthermore, the placing of Cuba on that list reinforces the effects of the illegal U.S. blockade by increasing difficulties for Cuba to engage in international trade, to carry out financial operations, and to acquire simple, basic staples for its people. This terrible and undeserved state of affairs prompted Prime Minister Mia Amor Motley to make the following statement about Cuba at the recently concluded United Nations General Assembly. And I'm going to quote the words of Prime Minister Motley. This is what she said: that Cuba can help so many in this world and yet be the continued victim of a blockade of over 60 years. But worse than that, a designation as a state sponsor of terrorism is wrong, wrong, wrong. And you know when a Bajan repeat a word 3 times, they really mean it. Wrong, wrong, wrong. We left Cuba last week and what the people of Cuba are being asked to face on a daily basis because of a designation by a dying presidency is wrong. And the voices of the global community, many of whom have been beneficiaries of Cuban assistance, need to stand united. The artificial division of who is right and who is wrong, and who is good and who is bad in the eyes of those who are powerful cannot continue to be the way in which this world functions. End of quote. That's my Prime Minister. I therefore wish to conclude my address today by demanding, on behalf of the government and people of Barbados, and indeed on behalf of the entire Caribbean community, that the government of the United States of America terminate its illegal blockade of Cuba and remove Cuba from the U.S. State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. I want to remind the government of the USA that every single year for the last 31 years, the overwhelming majority of the nations of the world gather at the United Nations and pass a resolution that affirms that the U.S. blockade of Cuba is illegal and that it must be terminated. Indeed, on the last occasion that the resolution was voted on, some 183 nations voted in favor of the resolution, and only 2 nations, inclusive of the United States, voted against it. I also want to remind the United States of America of a very relevant episode in its recent history that it seems to have forgotten. On the 26th of July 1964, almost exactly 2 years after the US had imposed its blockade on Cuba, the US-dominated Organization of American States, the OAS, followed the American lead and imposed a similar set of sanctions on Cuba. However, 11 years later, on the 29th of July 1975, the nations of the OAS voted to terminate their sanctions against Cuba. This historic OAS meeting was reported on by the New York Times newspaper, and I just want to share quickly with you the New York Times report, the actual words of the report, and I quote, "The Organization of American States tonight ended political and economic sanctions against Cuba, effectively abolishing the embargo imposed 11 years ago. The decision was approved by 16 of the 21 voting OAS members, including the United States." Explaining the United States vote in favor of the resolution, William S. Millard, the American delegate, said it represented, quote, "a generally acceptable solution since it was the will of a large majority. The vote," he said, quote, "places the issue in its proper perspective and permits us to concentrate our multilateral energies on the more fundamental problems of this hemisphere." End of quote. Secretary of State Kissinger had said that the United States would not make a move to improve relations with Cuba until the OAS embargo was ended. Mr. Millard said today that there may be, quote, conversations that might lead to some kind of normalization between Washington and Havana. That's end of quote. That's the end of the New York Times article. Well, that was 48 years ago. 48 years ago, the government of the United States of America voted to terminate the OAS's blockade of Cuba because, in the words of the US's permanent representative to the OAS, and I quote again, it was the will of a large majority, end of quote. And also because the removal of the OAS blockade, in his words, permits us to concentrate our multilateral energies on the more fundamental problems of this hemisphere, end of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the height of hypocrisy for the government of the United States to be able to understand so clearly why they should respect the will of the majority and act constructively in the interests of our hemisphere by voting to terminate the OAS's illegal blockade against Cuba, but pretend that they can't see that a similar logic applies to their own illegal blockade of Cuba. Brothers and sisters, we must never stop from calling out this hypocrisy. We must never resile from calling out this hypocrisy until it ends. On this first CARICOM Cuba Day Against Terrorism, I say, President Biden, do the right thing. End the blockade against Cuba. Help us to solidify our Caribbean as a zone of peace, free from all forms of terrorism. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.